So I think we'll make a start. And firstly, welcome to the second meeting of the authority this July, and thank you very much to members for making the time available. The reason, just to remind you, that we are having this meeting now is because, most unusually, we had a large number of apologies at the board meeting that took place last week on the 12th. And this topic that we're here to discuss today, which is modernising the fertility law, is of particular importance, and I wanted, and it's the stage where we have some important decisions to make, and I really wanted as many authority members in the room as possible. We are making this online, and there's a number of people observing the meeting. You're all very welcome. Can I just ask that everybody please remain on mute, and authority members, in the usual way, if you want to say something, just use the hand up button, and I can see everybody really well. There are quite a lot of important matters that we've got to decide today, and we need a clear consensus on the way forward in terms of legislative reform, and I'm going to outline that in a moment. So apologies firstly from Jonathan Herring and Alison Marsden. Just to remind everybody that, as usual, in the interest of transparency, this meeting will be recorded, and the recording will be placed on our website. Welcome as an observer today, Ali Margrave, who starts as the governance manager. I mentioned this to the authority at our meeting last week when we said goodbye, and thank you very much to Debbie, who's done sterling work assisting the board, the admin of the board, and is now leaving the HFEA at the end of the month, and we're delighted that Ali has joined and be responsible for both the authority and for AGC. So welcome, Ali. Ali is going to observe today and then join us properly, taking minutes and so on at our next meeting. So just before we get going,
I think Veronique will turn her camera off.
Sorry?
You said that loud.
I'm sorry, did somebody say something? No. Can you all please just go on to mute? Great. Can we have some declarations of interest, please? Let me think. That should be Tim, I think.
Yeah, I'm Tim Child. I'm PR at a licensed clinic.
Geeta?
Holder and permission of licensed clinics.
Thank you. Catherine?
Sorry. Yes, thank you. Julia, I have no declaration of interest relevant to the business that we're dealing with today, but I just wanted to put on record some recent appointments. So the first is that I've been appointed to the disciplinary committee of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, and the second is that I've been appointed as an institute director of the Chartered Insurance Institute, and also in that capacity as a board director for the Personal Finance Society, for which I also become a company director.
Well, firstly, congratulations on both of those appointments from everybody here. Well done, and they're lucky to have you. And Alison McTavish, I think.
Hi, Julia. Yes, BFS trustee and PET trustee. Thank you.
Thank you. And Francis.
Yes, I'm a trustee of Progress Educational Trust.
Thank you very much. Jason. Oh, yeah, Jason also.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm person responsible in a licensed clinic.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much,
Can you hear
Jason.
me? Oh.
Yeah. I think that's it. Anybody else? No, I think I haven't. Right. So to the business today, proposals on legislative reform were brought back to the authority in May following the public consultation, and I think there was broad consensus for most of the proposals, and we agreed that we should bring them back to the authority this month. and re-look at some of the key areas for further discussion once a bit more work has been done. We've set you a cover paper which setting out, current state and what we consider to be the key risks in those areas. You'll see there's 4 annexes which cover the proposal, and as I said that we were going to do last week, there are 3 areas where we've given a lot more detail, which are consent, donor anonymity, and scientific developments. This information, by the way, is already on our website. You've also, members have also received a confidential working draft of what the proposals to the Department of Health and Social Care might look like. It's very much a work in progress at this stage, but you give you a general idea. So just to remind everybody that what we will do is the ultimate aim is to have agreed proposals that will be set out along the lines of the draft you members have already received. There will be a final draft, if possible, for our meeting in September for approval, and then the proposal document will be sent to the Department of Health and Social Care. That is, if possible, what we'd like to achieve. So the way this meeting is going to work is we'll get a short introduction. I'm going to look to Claire to that to tell us what the key proposals that we've actually agreed upon, and then we'll look at the 3 areas where there isn't complete agreement and look at the different options we have, and hopefully make a decision at the end of the discussion of each option and see if we can agree. I would like to, just before we start, just to make the comment that particularly these 3 areas, consent, donor anonymity, and scientific innovation, are very complex, they're very difficult. There is, I think, no right or easy answer. I myself, am fluctuating, and I think the exec feel they're also fluctuating because, one day one proposal seems good, and then you sort of discuss another option, and that sort of there's an argument for doing that. There's no really right answer here. I think what we should try to do is get to the best option under the circumstances, even if it's not perfect. We're never going to get to a perfect option. And we do have the possibility in our proposals of to the department of noting that where there's an option that we sort of like but think might be either there are issues with bits of it or might need some more work or so on, we can note that to the department and ask them, for their advice and view, and it might be that they say there's more work that needs to be done or whatever. We don't have to have this in the perfect state before it goes to the department. And I think it is probably more important that we get something to the department to get the ball rolling, to get them thinking about parliamentary timetable and so on in September, than it is to try to get to a perfect set of proposals, because we're never going to do that. So that's sort of where I am. Obviously, people feel very free to say what they think, and if we can't agree, then we do have a sort of plan B about how we'll go back and do some further work. But all I'm saying is, don't feel we've got to get to the perfect answer, because I think that's almost going to be impossible. So I think without sort of further ado, I'm going to hand over to Claire. The way this works, we've got a gallery view on Zoom. So although we can't see everybody, if your hand goes up, we will be able to see it, I think. It will come up, because we're going to try to keep some slides as an aid memoir on the screen of the options, because I just think it'd be more helpful than trying to find it all in the papers. And I will also give you, page numbers and so on as we go. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the proposals 1 to 13 in the annex, which are on pages 6 to 7, I think, of the PDF that you've got, because those are really, to some extent, much more straightforward, and I think we've already agreed. But that they're obviously still up for discussion if you want. So Claire, let's start with that.
Thanks, Julia. I don't have a huge amount to add to what you said. Just by way of introduction, to remind members, I think as set out in the introduction to the paper, that these proposals have been developed over a number of years with a series of different types of input, several authority discussions, some expert advisory groups, the Legislative Reform Advisory Group, which met several times, and we're very grateful for all those members, and the public consultation that took place earlier in the year, where we received thousands of responses and we shared the headlines with you at the May meeting. Following the May meeting, there were 4 areas, as Julia said, where you asked us to go back and do some further work. And the majority of this meeting was to discuss those areas, which are consent, access to donor or release of donor information, and scientific developments. The 4th area where we had more discussion in May was on what was meant by the proposal about greater regulation of what we called allied services. And in looking at that, we felt that what was being asked was a better description, which is we've started to set out in our draft main report, which you all have a confidential copy of. So it was a descriptive, more descriptions that we were different choices. So there isn't a separate paper on that in the way that there is on the other 3. The proposals that Julia pointed to are on pages 6 and 7 of the PDF of the authority paper, and they're proposals 1 to 13 in Annex A. And these are the proposals that are drafted in the same way in Annex A as they were in the public consultation. It may be that over the course of the summer, in terms of drafting and editing, some of the final wording has changed. But those are the proposals where we think there has been the greatest authority agreement that these should be in the final proposals for change.
Thank you. So I think it's really proposals 1 to 8 are the
1 to 13.
1 to 13. Yeah, so 1 to 13. Yeah, are the main ones. So does anybody have any comments on those, which I thought were sort of rather easier ones, or are we happy to go straight to the sort of more formal drafting of the proposals for us to review in September? I'm seeing lots of nods, which means I think anybody has any other comments? No. Okay, I mean, I think that's fine, because we've discussed them really at length several times, so I wouldn't expect there to be too much concern. We'll go back into the proposals and do, refine the drafting, and then we can move forward. Okay. So now, the first of our 3 more tricky items is consent. And I'm going to ask Peter to provide a sort of brief introduction, remind us where we are, and then there are 5 options for us to consider. Just to remind you, this is Annex B, which is pages 9 to 10 of the PDF.
Thanks, Julia. Afternoon, everyone. Right, so consent. If you'll remember, we developed 3 proposals for consent, 2 of which you've already agreed in Annex A. That's consent relating to the sharing of fertility patient data and consent for donating embryos that might allow subsequent research embryo banking. That leaves the broader question of consent more generally. And just before I get to the 5 options, you'll all be familiar with the centrality of consent to fertility treatment. It's obviously vital in healthcare generally, but it is particularly central to the legal framework regarding fertility treatment, and it is particularly complex. And we all know why that is, so I don't need to go into that in any great detail. But crucially, it involves more than one person. It involves a whole series of thoughts about different scenarios, what to do after death, and so on and so forth, which are different from most medical treatment. And accordingly, the law as it currently stands is complex. And we know, don't we, that both patients and people who work in clinics can find that law complex. And with complexity, of course, comes the possibility of error. So any system that relies on complexity, needs to do so, if you like, for important reasons. So I think that's what's driven our work on consent so far, is this sense in which it is perhaps more complex than we would all ideally like. So that leads to, obviously, the idea that there ought to be simpler models. Now, I think consent, as we found out from the consultation, but also from our own discussions, it is very much easier to identify what's wrong with consent or what's difficult about consent than it is to identify a means of solving it. At the consultation, we proposed the idea of an opt-out model. So this was the idea that while the sheer circumstances that many fertility patients face varies enormously, a very significant chunk of fertility patients are effectively couples to whom are in a formal relationship with each other, and they want to use their own gametes in order to have treatment. And the idea was that for that large group of patients, it might be possible to design a kind of standard consent model that once, that would cover, if you like, a great block of people. And then from that, you would, as consent became more bespoke and complex, you would need to go into more complicated models. Now, as the paper makes clear, that opt-out model received sort of mixed support. Some people thought that they were in support of it. Other people thought it created a whole set of other problems. And indeed, with consent, with any kind of opt-out model, there is an open question as the extent to which people's consent has been taken for granted, or in more extreme cases, coerced. So standing back from this, the paper then sort of stands back and looks at 5 possible decisions here. One of which is actually to keep with the status quo. It has the merit, at least, it is certainly complex, but it is something that clinics have been using for very many years. It is at least known and understood by both ourselves and the sector. Clearly, in that table at section 3 of the paper, you can understand the disadvantages and the risks that go with that. The second option is that recommended opt-out model that we consulted on. It would, as it says, make it clear and easier for a majority of patients, but clearly it doesn't include all sorts of patients, and it did not receive clear majority support when we consulted on it. A third option is effectively to keep the current system, but make a series of small, if you like, administrative changes, tinkering to the system. That would certainly be less controversial and more achievable. But I think, people, given the complexities of consent, people may think that's an inadequate response to the kind of problems that have been identified with the regime. The fourth option is effectively picking up Julia's sort of language here, a recommendation to the department that actually would say, look, consent is over complex, or more complex than ideal. And what it needs is a thorough overhaul of the regime. But that is work that's going to have to take place over the coming months. It certainly isn't something we can resolve over the summer now. That gives a clear sort of, if you like, direction of travel on this issue. But what it doesn't result in is a clear recommendation. And the fifth recommendation is very much focusing around concerns around legal parenthood, which is particularly complex. We have discussed elements of this before, and this builds on a recent academic paper which suggested some ways in which this might be overhauled. And again, I think moving from that academic paper to a workable model will require quite a bit of work, and certainly can't be constructed over the summer, but one can imagine a recommendation to the department, which again set that as a clear direction of travel. So I think that's all I want to say at this stage. It's very much open to the floor as to whether or not how people feel about those 5 options.
Thank you, Peter. That's very helpful, and you will have on your screens those 5 options. So let's start some discussion. Francis.
It's a question for you, Peter. How prescriptive does the Act need to be in terms of consent? I can just feel that the way we take consent might continue to evolve over a number of years. Does the Act need to be very prescriptive as to exactly how consent is obtained? Or can it be more broad, which would allow us to continue to fine-tune and allow the consent process to evolve as we and patients and service providers see fit over the next few years?
I think there's considerable flexibility in how one would redraft an Act. And there's always a tension, I think, Francis, between the extent to which you set principles or outcomes that the Act is intending to achieve, or indeed you specify, if you like, the precise things that need to be written down and tested. So, I think there are ways of, I don't have an answer now, but the Act does not require something necessarily to be so prescriptive that it's not amenable to change over time. And as you say, that's something we might want to think about.
That's helpful. Thank you.
And also, we are considering that approach in other areas, which allows some flexibility. So you've got general principles in the Act with changes or all that sort of thing. So it allows you to be a bit more nimble. Alison and Christine.
Thank you. Yeah, consent, I think, it is a major issue in the sector, and has been for quite some time. And I think some of the feedback picked up in that. And I think this is an opportunity that we do need to take a bit of time. I know this is challenging with all the other areas HFE have to address at this time, but we have indicated that we work with others to make some recommendations later, but we need to put a marker in the sand to say this is an area that we do need to overhaul in light of legal parenthood, but just the whole consent process. And I think that did come through in the consultation responses. So it's a bit difficult whether I'm going for 4 or 5 or a combination of 4 and 5, yes, both of which need a lot of work. I totally get that. But I think within the sector, there would be people willing to work with the authority to get to where we need to be as a combined project. So that's where I would be sitting on. The court cases that have come out that have shown that. Sorry, somebody else.
Yeah. Christine. Christine.
Thank you, Julia. I agree. I really like option 5. I think if the Act is to be modernised, then it should take account of all the different types of modern family groups that we have now. And of course, it's a lot of work, but if that was then combined with this recommendation that this is looked into in more detail for the future work, then I think that's where I would like to be, because I think it is very much moving forward to where perhaps parenthood should be, where legal parenthood should be. And if it could be simpler, and it would seem to me, I haven't read the paper, the academic paper by Jackson and Horsey, but it was seem to just declares a desire to be the legal parent, then perhaps that's much simpler and doesn't discriminate between different family groups either. It's more equitable.
Thank you. Catherine?
Yes, thank you. I'm in a very similar place. I'm thoroughly behind the proposal of 4, a thorough overhaul of consent with the series of principles, particularly if we think that there is at least a possibility, if not quite a strong argument for the kind of outcomes drafting that Peter outlined. And I was struck by the range of views that we had in consultation. And I think it is right that this option properly safeguards against the really good reservations about an opt-out model, which implicitly was, of course, reduce choice and would open up the dangers of implicit coercion between couples, etc. And I also would like within that option a principle to say that we would fundamentally consider the importance of consent needing to be proactive, not something passive or subject to external influence. Regarding option 5, I think that the modern law review criticism of extant legal parenthood provisions, I think it's fascinating, I think it's compelling, I think it's consistent with the HFEA vision and determination to shape for the future. But I think it does require a lot more work. So in essence, what I'm saying is that my vote would be for option 4, but that considerations raised by this newer argument around legal parenthood be further explored, not necessarily for proposals on changes to some detailed changes to the wording of the legislation, but to hold open the option that after more work in perhaps 2 or 3 years' time, that is something that there would be flexibility for us to be able to address.
Thank you. Alex? And then Tim.
Sorry, Gita was first.
I'm so sorry, Gita, yes, absolutely.
I actually agree with my colleagues. I mean, it's a very important and complex issue in our day-to-day practice. And it is really, we have an opportunity now for this reform. So I am also keen on option 4. Option 5 is fascinating, as Catherine said. Serving modern families as well, but I haven't read that academic paper. Apologies for that. I think we could take this opportunity to achieve this reform that is needed to address our patients' needs, and I would also go for option 4.
Okay, thank you, Gita. Alex.
Thank you. Thanks, Julia. I actually agree with the last 3 comments that I would recommend option 4, and agree with kind of Catherine and Christine's kind of bids for a little bit of option 5 included in that, if I could call it like that. I think when you look at the healthcare kind of scandals over the last few years, all of which have been NHS, but especially the maternity ones in different parts of the countries, it's been consent or lack thereof that has been at the heart of a lot of the harm that's been undertaken. So I think really we do have, and secondly, I think there's also been different organisations have different channel shifts in terms of where consent is being given, and the law isn't perhaps keeping up with that. So I do think we need to have this kind of thorough overhaul, to use the language in the option, just to make sure we're learning from as many sources as possible into getting this right for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thank you. Tim?
I completely agree with everything just been said as well. I think surprising consistency perhaps here from those of us that have raised our hands. It's the consent process at the moment is a bit of a mess. It is confusing for patients and for the sector, for staff as well. And as was mentioned earlier on, there are mistakes that are made that have far-reaching consequences. And partly the mistakes are because it's so confusing and seemingly inconsistent with different scenarios. So absolutely, I think us not pushing for a major change in this would be seen as us not really doing what we should be doing. by the sector. They are expecting us to do something here. So I think just rolling over and suggesting things to just stay the same I don't think is acceptable. So I'd completely go for option 4 again, but mentioning option 5 there as sort of saying if we could touch on that as well, that would be positive, or at least explore that side of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jason?
Yeah, thank you. I'm very much of the same mind, conscious of how difficult it will be. I think one thing that's not been raised, although you may have touched on it to begin with, Julia, is the fact that the sector is very used to the overcomplicated consent regime that we currently have. And there will inevitably be, I'm sure, some risk and some pain across the sector in changing the consent regime. But nevertheless, I don't think that should stop us from doing it and going for option 4, a thorough overhaul of the regime. I do also think, though, agree with many colleagues who want to also try in a way to touch upon option 5.
Graham? Graham?
I won't take long. I agree with that. I think the only thing that I feel is that, of course, we're trying to work with consensus, and I just wonder whether that doesn't limit us to some degree. I mean, I was thinking in relation to a later issue, the 14-day rule, that would not have had consensus in the general public in 1990 if it was put to them. And so there's, in relation to defining legal parenthood in a different way, as in 5, you may not get consensus, yet it may be the right thing in terms of the general public, yet it may be the right thing to do in law. And I think as well as that, this affects other areas of law as well. And if we could also have some allies in this case in relation to the sort of further exploration we might do under 4, rather than keeping it to ourselves, that might be helpful.
Yes, that's a very good point, and we've discussed that here about, we want to partner with others or share, or work with others to get to the result. Absolutely. So we've got some pretty broad consensus here. Can we just hear from the people we haven't heard from? So Gudrun, can I just see what you might think?
Thanks. I think this is not really my super area of expertise, but I'm listening to everybody and feeling that probably a thorough overhaul of the consent regime would probably work. But I do kind of, having just listened to Graham, I'm a bit of a person that does listen to the last person, believes in what the last person said is the thing that I think is going for me. I think it's right that I think if we feel there should be a change to legal parenthood, or even if it's not going to be the whole world's not happiest about, but that will bring us to the best end point, and maybe we should push for that. But at the same time, can 4 and 5 be done sort of together, or does one exclude the other completely?
I'll draw it together in a minute, but it's a very good point. Francis, if I can ask you for your view.
I don't think I have anything to add. I agree, a thorough overhaul of the consent regime, although that will undoubtedly be hard work, probably in the long run is the best thing to do in terms of providing the best possible service to patients and making sure that both at the time they have treatment, they do understand what they're consenting to, but also putting in place those safeguards that you need for the unlikely event when things go wrong in the future. And it needs to be clear what was intended and what is possible then, in the event of the death of one partner or whatever might have happened. But I was very taken with the argument for change to legal parenthood as well. And so I think, like many of the others who've commented, addressing both of those issues would seem to be the right thing to do in this day and age.
Okay. Thank you all. I think just to draw this bit together, we've got an extraordinarily unanimous consensus here for 4, with I've sort of put 5 in brackets because actually 5 is sort of included. They're not mutually exclusive. Julian asked that, but not. I think if you look at 4, it's to recommend a complete overhaul, identifying, some of the things we've been thinking about, like opt-out. We can develop the proposal, a general proposal to the department, noting some of the areas of extra work that we might want to look at, like opt-out in some cases, for example. In the risk section, we have said, well, it means our recommendation might contain a series of principles without much detail, and we might be open to criticism. But actually, for myself, I'm prepared to live with that criticism, because actually what we're not saying we're not doing anything further. What we're saying is this is the direction of travel. These are the overarching principles, particularly in the areas, some areas of 5. This might not be the right time to address it, and we might need flexibility in the Act, which will allow us to make changes as we go forward through regulations or something. And I think we're also suggesting, quite a bit more work in order to do this. Robust recommendation to the department. Thank you for your comments, everybody, really helpful. And I think we can move on, because we got it. We'll draft something up for your approval in September. Okay. So the next item is on pages 12 to 14 of your paper. We have access to donor information, which is Annex C. Again, not easy. Some quite tricky options to discuss. Claire's going to provide a brief outline of that, and again, we'll look at the options and hopefully take everybody's view as we go on.
Thanks, Julia. So as it said in the cover paper, 3 separate proposals relating to this issue were set out in the consultation, and 2 of those, which are numbers 9 to 10 on Annex A, which is on page 5 and 6 of the PDF, were about clinics being required by law to inform donors and recipients about the potential for future donor identity through, and the actually amended to require all donors and recipients have access to information about the implications before starting treatment. I think both of those are agreed, and they had overwhelmingly favourable responses from the consultation. I think subject to some wording changes. For example, today we're talking about DNA testing websites. In 5 years' time, it might be something different, so slightly broader terminology. The proposal that had the most mixed response was about any future changes to the current system of donor anonymity or donor identification. I think that several issues were raised by respondents, both with the proposals and also other issues to consider. So it was generally recognised by respondents that the current system of disclosure by the HFEA when a child turns 18, if they know about that they're donor conceived, has been overtaken by other things, whether it's social media, DNA testing websites, or other things. There were other broad principles that were raised by the consultation, particularly about who has the right to access the information. And by changing to a potential dual track system, you formally change the right of the child or the adult when they turn 18 to that information to the child, to the parents. So, sorry. Although in reality, that's quite a complicated area anyway, and parents are making decisions on behalf of their children, taking away those rights at all times. We also received feedback that perhaps there should be retrospective opening of the register, which is something we haven't considered, as well as getting rid of any anonymity at all. So all donors should be identifiable from the age of 18, from the time of receiving the donation. I think the balance the authority asked to make in terms of decisions is what is in the law at present and what could be set out in a future law, which has consequences that we clearly understand, because many of the decisions that you might make today have unintended consequences, which we haven't really thought through. We also don't know what the challenges may be in the future from social sites. And it's a balance between what system we have now and any advantages a new system may be. And in fact, at 2.6, we noted that perhaps the case is more stark than already set out in the consultation, that perhaps it is keep the as is or get rid of anonymity altogether, because that's the reality of the current situation for those parents who are choosing to try and find out who their donor is. The options are set out in 3.2. These are the options that we developed in discussions with the Legislative Reform Advisory Group. That's not to say that there might be many other multiple options or sub-options, but these are the ones we looked at initially. And I suppose just lastly, I'd say that some of the more perhaps, I don't know if radical is the right word, but some of the options, for example, removing anonymity completely, we don't know, what the public appetite would be for that, what impact that might have on the level of donation, apart from we know what happened when the law was changed this time, when there was a blip first, when the number of donations went down and then they rose ever since. But we haven't done a kind of full options appraisal of the implications of that option. Do you want me, Julia, to kind of set out the option?
I think we're happy with what's in the paper. I mean, if people have got, has anybody got any questions on any of the four options, or they don't understand them clearly? Okay, then I think we can move directly to a discussion. So who'd like to go first? We're going to do this roughly in the same way as we did the last discussion, just asking everybody for their views. So would anybody like to start? I said it was very difficult. Alison, there you go. Thank you.
There we are. It is very, very difficult. And I think this is one of the most challenging things that we're thinking about today. I think where we actually want to be is the removal of anonymity, but that's way down the line. And the other options, again, are a bit in the middle. And I actually wonder whether we keep status quo whilst we work up, or perhaps it's not HFEA, perhaps it's professional bodies that start investigating how the removal of anonymity from the donor service would be, because that is a big piece of work to be done. And I don't know how that will be. I know we spoke about it years ago when New Zealand did it, for example. And we're still not there yet. So I do wonder why we haven't progressed it within any of the professional bodies or just within the UK as to look at the removal of anonymity completely. The early identification by consent, making it a voluntary system, I think would be very confusing for, maybe not confusing, but just would need a lot of attention to detail within centres as to which donors had consented to what, when and how. And I think the double track system, again, is donor choice, and thinking about the donor conceived individuals, what does that mean for them in the future as to whether their donor chose to be anonymous or not? And I think that brings into a lot of counselling, implication counselling, and again, that's been discussed in quite a lot of detail as to what that means, and whether we look at calling it implication sessions rather than counselling. But implications at this stage, I think, would prevent a lot of issues in the future. So in a long-winded way, but as a way of kicking off the discussion, I guess I might be coming back to A at this moment in time, when we've just agreed that we're going to overhaul consent. There's only so much we can do, but again, put a line in the sand that this is not going to be forever. We need to move on and perhaps review donor anonymity being completely removed.
Thank
That's
you.
it. Starter for 10.
Thank you. Catherine.
I agree absolutely with Alison's analysis, but I draw the different conclusion. To me, that analysis suggests to us that partly because of consistency with the principle that we applied in deciding the first point. We have to go for option C, recognising its difficulties, recognising that it will require a lot more work and a lot more consultation. But to me, option C, for the very good reasons that Alison has outlined, is the only viable of those 4 options that we should be considering, and that's consistent with our determination to future-proof this legislation.
Thank you. Tim?
Sort of feel, again, I sort of agree with what Alison said, but we're in the situation now where when we talk to patients who are looking at using donor gametes, and we talk about how the law is at the moment, but how essentially with home genetic testing, it's sort of fairly meaningless, because it doesn't take much at all for someone to go onto one of the databases and triangulate very, very quickly into the family of the donor, whether it was the donor themselves or a sibling or someone. It would not take long at all to triangulate in. So my sort of feeling is really, if we're trying to, a bit following on from the consent conversation, we're actually looking at what the issues are, trying to move something forward, that option C with planning to remove anonymity, for me, would be the option that I'd be favouring.
Okay, thank you. Graham?
Yes, I think I favour that as well. I mean, the difficulty is I did support the double track system, and I recognise that, you know, only half of patients agreed and a third of professionals. And if we have a consultation, you've got to listen to that. And I really supported the double track system because I thought that was as good as we could do at the moment, given what my gut instinct is about where we are as a country on this. But I do wonder whether that answer, whether rejection of the double track system was an indication of a desire for greater transparency and removal of anonymity. I mean, it may be going in that direction rather than having a sort of conservative interpretation of it. But the thing that I recognise with this is that it's such a huge overhaul of the principles of the 1990 Act, which were grounded in the anonymity of the donor. But my suspicion is that the majority of donors now know that their anonymity cannot be guaranteed. So the fact that the number of donors is rising at a time when there is an increasing sense among donors that their anonymity, in relation to children will not be guaranteed, suggests that maybe transparency would not reduce the number of donors quite so dramatically as we imagine. So given that all the movement is towards transparency and the removal of anonymity, I'd want an exploration of that. But as others have said, I think it's quite a big ask, and if we're going to do all that work on consent, can this be done as well? And perhaps it can, because we're not going to get another chance, and the world is shifting around us. So I suppose I am more inclined to go for C if D is not deliverable. And D, we always thought the double track system was just a temporary home for us before transparency and the removal of anonymity will come in.
Thank you. Christine?
Yes, I think I would agree that I would go for C, the removal of anonymity completely. Clearly, there is proof of principle already in New Zealand that it can work. I think people have a right to know their genetic origin. It can also be very important for actually identifying disease susceptibility as well, to know one's genetic origins. So I think that's really important. I think the age of 18 is far too late for a child to find out who their biological parents or parent may very well be. I don't know why it's so old, because I know a child is criminally liable from the age of 10 or 12, depending on what country they live in. So I think 18 is far too late in any case. I mean, I think it can be tricky, but I definitely think people have a right to know. The only question I would raise is adopted children do not have a right to know from a very early age. So there would be a discrepancy there between the rights of adopted children and the rights of donor-conceived individuals. So that may be a little bit tricky. But generally, I would support the removal of anonymity.
Thank you. Geeta.
Thank you. Yeah, Christine made a really good point about adopted children and their rights. We are talking about we may not get another chance, but we have the opportunity to make a significant reform and future-proofing what we are doing from those perspectives. Removal of anonymity completely seems to be the right thing. But I am
sorry, Geeta, it's really hard to hear you. Could you just speak a bit more clearly?
Yeah, I just would like a little bit more information about what we received from any ethnic minority population respondents or groups that responded to the consultation, because as it is, we have a huge shortage of ethnic minority donors. And we do know that a lot of women and couples are going abroad. Still, whether this would further make it difficult, at least for some period of time. Double track systems sounds good, but then Graham articulated that quite well as why it may not be the right thing. Early identification by consent seemed like my preference originally, although in an ideal world for future proofing, I like the idea of removal of anonymity completely. But I just wonder if you could give any information, Claire, about the respondents and whether there was any particular concern expressed by the population.
I can't give you detailed concerns based on ethnicity. What I can say off the top of my head is that there wasn't overwhelming support for a dual track system, but that's not necessarily because all those people who didn't support it supported the removal of anonymity. Though I'd say off the top of my head, certainly some of the larger professional organisations and those involved in donor conception probably more supported that than the double track system. But I think there wasn't really any unified support for any other option particularly, but I think anonymity was probably the one that was recognised more than others. I think the other thing it is worth, if the authority wanted us to think about, is it doesn't have to necessarily be all or nothing when the Act changes. For example, I can't think of any piece of legislation, but maybe Peter can, where it's, in 5 years' time. Well, this is actually the 2005 changes were changes that would have an effect later. So it could be, for example, the recommendation is that the law is changed so that over the course of the next, 5 or 10 years, anonymity is removed. So after a certain date, there's no such thing as anonymous donation. If the law was changed in 2024, it didn't have to come into place in immediate effect, which would perhaps give some a chance to kind of get more of a view about public opinion on this, as well as the views of donors and current donor-conceived individuals and their families themselves. So it could be the staggered approach.
I think that's clearly right. It would also, having a sort of run-in would have time as well to particularly sort of change the public conversation, if you like. There's a kind of sense in which these sorts of changes do take time. And it seems to me that if this is the way the authority is sort of shaping up in terms of its likely recommendation, while clearly, as Claire said in her introduction, we've not, for example, consulted on this. We don't know where the balance of that opinion is. We need to frame any recommendation in that way. But I suppose, above all else, it has the logic, doesn't it, of a sense in which, as Graham said, the reason we consulted on a double track system is it appeared to, one, pay attention to the ways in which the changing sting and the like, but it also gave an element of choice. But clearly, it is a halfway house, so to speak, and that if the logic of the changing circumstances brought about by DNA testing, brought about by huge uptake of social media and the like, is such that really anonymity cannot be protected in any serious way, then it does inevitably draw you into some variant of C, depending with you know, however you might view the time, the particular way the thing is drafted, the degree of policy work that's required, etc., etc. There's a sort of sense in which, from a technological and social point of view, this is kind of where things are going rather inexorably.
Jason. Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Yes, Jason.
Thank you. Yeah, this is clearly a very difficult issue to consider. Taking on board what Peter said about removal of anonymity right now, I'm not averse to change, but it does feel like it's a huge leap from what we're currently doing. We're effectively jumping off a cliff in terms of our policy with regard to donor anonymity. I don't know, because I have no evidence to suggest it, but I don't know what the public reaction to that would be or what public sentiment is. I also don't know what the effect would be on the availability of UK donors. So we talk, don't we, about the availability of donors overall, but often we mix UK donors and imported donors. So yes, there may have been an increase in donors, but what we don't have is a handle on what UK-based donors would feel about an immediate removal of anonymity or a kind of cliff edge scenario. I do agree that a double track system is effectively us accepting that we're heading towards a removal of donor anonymity. But at the same time, I do feel like that stepping stone might offer some comfort and might give us some time for, you know, greater public debate, greater discussion, and also a little bit of time to gather more evidence on the potential effects and feedback from stakeholders, etc. So I am very much on the fence here between either a hybrid option that allows us to do both a double track followed by removal of anonymity, or one or the other. And I have been thinking about this for some time and changing my mind quite regularly, but that's where I stand at the moment.
Thank you. And I'm seeing a thumbs up from Geeta, who I think is following that as well. So sort of i.e. the fourth option, you being from the time to the third option. Gudrun.
I've just written down two things. I sort of agree with everybody, but I've written down two things that maybe if the anxiety is that this will affect donors, is there any way that there could be a survey of potential donors or donors from the past of, you know, to find out if they would have donated if there had been complete anonymity? I don't know whether that's possible. Maybe it's already been done. And
if we were going to do this.
Pardon?
I mean, if we were going to move to option C, which is removal of anonymity completely, that, you know, there may be some extra work like finding out the effect and so on.
And my second thing that I jotted down was that there is the access to DNA information and the use of social media and triangulation, and I think we have a pretty good understanding of how successful that can be and how traumatic it can be for people as well. But I also feel that there's a big inequality in the access of that information. You need to be certainly tech savvy. You need to be able to pay for DNA tests or understand how to access the information of DNA tests. So it would mean that those people that could do those things could circumvent the need for finding out who their donor was or whatever. And that would be unfair to those people who wouldn't know how to do that. So if we're going to be socially fair in our sort of relationship to donor information,
it's probably a good idea to try and go for 3 with whatever caveats are needed via the double track system or whatever's needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel Cutting wants to say something.
It was just a point following on from Alison earlier on, and a comment about anonymity. When anonymity was removed in 2005, we didn't see probably anticipated or what we thought we may see in a huge decrease in donors. Probably the demographics changed, but we still had a good number, especially in the years post 2005, of UK donors. So I think the attitude towards donation is far more open than it was going back quite a number of years. I think it is a large piece of work to do, that we have to work very carefully with our stakeholders. We've got very good relationships with a lot of stakeholders we've got in donation, so we need to use those going forward to think about how this can be done sensitively, but also what information that we can help provide clinics, so that Alison stressed the importance of implications and the information implications counselling around this, and what support we could provide donors if this was the case. So I think, you know, it needs to be set out in a thoroughly researched and proper piece of work.
Yeah. Thank you. Geeta.
Thank you, Julia. Well, Gudrun mentioned about possible social inequality by doing this, particularly for those who are digitally excluded and not technologically advanced. But currently there is an inequality because a lot of women, I'm kind of trying to say a lot of women and couples from the same background are struggling to find donors and going abroad. And I think we need to do work. I think what Peter and Claire articulated about giving space to get more information and public opinion, and also more information from donors about how we would respond to such big change. We need more work to be done for option C.
Francis, thank you. And noted. Francis?
I can see us moving towards removal of anonymity completely at some point as almost the inevitable conclusion of all the other things we've discussed, all the other drivers that are there. But one thing we haven't really talked about very much is the effect on couples seeking the use of donor gametes who feel uncomfortable with the removal of anonymity. And not necessarily something we would want to do something about, but I think we need to be aware of the fact that there will be some couples who will go abroad for treatment precisely because they want to select a jurisdiction where anonymity, as far as it can be, is guaranteed. So I just think that's something that we should bear in mind, even if it doesn't necessarily influence our decision making.
Yeah,
I think it's something that's happening already.
Yeah. As Claire made the point, this is probably something that's happening already since the 2005 Act now became sort of a live issue, if you will. Alison.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're all saying much the same thing, that we really want to see the removal of anonymity. It's a huge piece of work to be undertaken, and I don't think for 1 minute that within the sector there will be any pushback from removal of anonymity. There's always been a feeling that patients choosing donors should be involved in every step of the way, from deciding when and if they're having treatment to which donor they want to use. It's a huge life implicating situation. I just think that the piece of work we need to do is huge. And then looking at that from the timeline as to how we take this forward. And I guess I'm bouncing it back to yourself, Julia, or Peter, or Claire, to say, how do you think this could work? This working towards anonymity, and what we should do in the interim, or do we just put to the department that we want to move towards removal of anonymity straight away?
I mean, I think we mentioned this in the paper. We currently have a dual track system kind of by default, if not in the law. So the current system is officially anonymity until 18 and then apply for information. Unofficially, it's those parents who are trying to find out about a donor early are doing so quite easily, and sometimes for free, sometimes for a small amount of money on the have we frozen again?
Don't know.
Sometimes for a small amount of money. So by the reality is that I think we currently have an unofficial dual track system. So it may be that I think we'll have to go away and think about it, but we can come back in September with a firmer idea, which says something like, the authority recognise the to future-proof you would get to the removal of anonymity, but perhaps we're way off that in a number of years. And in the meantime, we will work with others over the next, 5 years, 8 years on all these separate things before that change in the law would take place.
I think that's broadly right. It's a recommendation, if you like, that posits an end state. So instead of saying you need to make change X now, it says the clear direction of travel is this, and the sort of steps that get you from here to there are these. And then depending on how conversations go with the department.
Unfortunately, you've frozen again, Peter, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying there.
Make decisions about what kind of work is actually, we do need to survey evidence.
Yeah, okay.
I think
sorry, did we freeze?
You froze a little bit, but I think we got the message that
you got the message,
this is where we want to end up, and in the meantime, this is what's happening. And I think you're right, Claire, we do have a dual system in place already.
Yeah.
The other thing, I think it was Christine who's talked about 18 being quite old. Again, we haven't done any policy analysis on this, but it could be that between now and the time anonymity, if that's the proposal, is removed, that there's a kind of step in between that reduces 18 to another age.
Yeah.
But again, we haven't done any thinking on that at all.
Just before I wrap this up, I'd like Alex. I don't think we've had your view.
Thanks, Julia. I didn't have much to add. I was in agreement with colleagues. I think removal of anonymity would be the option I would go for. I totally agree with Geeta that we would need an equality impact assessment, but I know that is done kind of in government when anything is kind of moving forward into law. So I was taking it as read that we'd kind of be alerted for that. I think people rarely now do anything significant without the expectation they might be able to be found unless you're one of these people that has absolutely no digital footprint at all. And I think that would particularly apply to the population demographics of people that donate. So I think donors will be found whether this is changed or not, as is kind of referenced in the paper. So I'd much rather it was done in a way in which the clinics had some kind of control of the process, and we had some kind of control of the process than endorsing another route, and then there would be backdoor way to doing it. So I think just the information age has overtaken where we are, really.
Yeah, thank you. Any other comments on this section? Okay, so where I think we've got to is near enough unanimity on 3, i.e. the removal of anonymity completely, with 2 or 3 of you saying, well, maybe we should, sort of look to a double track system first and then morph to complete removal of anonymity over time. I mean, there are 2 points on that. One, Peter's made a good point that we've sort of got that at the moment, really, because it is relatively easy to find out your donor. And if you think about how much, AI and generally digital sort of footprint, or the ability to find your digital footprint has improved over the last 5 years, and in the next 5 years, it's going to be this is going to get easier and easier. So, even if there's some barriers to it at the minute, it's 5 years time there won't be any barriers. So we're looking at something that is a lost battle if you want to keep donor anonymity, I think. I'm also mindful of, and I'll probably I think I might want to refer to it again in the next section as well, Graham saying that, we may have to take a decision that the public might not like very much, but it's the right thing to do. And I think we will want to do more work on this. We will want to do more consultation on various areas of it. But the truth of the matter is, regardless, I think if we think it's the right thing to do, we should do it anyway. Our proposals we will put in there the proposal to the department that anonymity will be removed completely. We would recommend that it would be removed completely, but that there are perhaps stages that we can go through. There's a way of doing it. It's not something we maybe want to do immediately. I would myself cancel against sort of 5 to 8 year period. I think if you're going to do it and we're going to overhaul the law fairly quickly, which needs to be done, we need to look at this in a shorter time frame. But it will come out once we start discussing it in detail, and once we get the department's view. I guess they'll be quite, we'll get a much better idea of what the challenges and roadblocks are. But I think if we've got a direction of travel with an end game, and the end game is removal of anonymity completely, then I think we're pretty unanimous in that. How you get there, there will definitely be some further discussions. If everyone's happy for that sort of trajectory, then that's what we'll do. Yeah, great. Thank you very much indeed. Now we come to, I was going to say one of the more challenging areas, but actually they're all challenging. So I think it's the third challenging area, which is scientific developments. In a second, I'm going to ask Anna to provide a brief introduction to this. And then we'll we'll discuss the recommendations. There are 4 broad areas which she's going to talk about. You can see that sort of future-proofing the Act, new cell, and you'll see them in the Proofing Act. I think is page 16 at future-proofing the Act is at page 16, para 210 from para 210. Then new cell types, which is page 17, para 3.4, the 14-day rule, which is set out on page 18, and essentially genome editing, which is page 19. You've got them all there, but that's just for your reference. And we put them up on the screen. So to begin with, let me ask Anna to take you through them and what the options are.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, so the final proposal that we're considering this afternoon in further detail is on scientific developments. And in the consultation, there were 2 questions. The first proposal in the report related to giving the HFEA greater discretion to support innovation in treatment. So it was discussing sandboxes, and that overall did receive very positive feedback in the consultation. And the proposal to be considered in further depth at this meeting is the one which we put forward on future-proofing of the Act. The details are set out in Annex D, and we're asking the authority to discuss the options set out to make recommendations. There were quite mixed responses to the future-proofing of the Act, because although there was a lot of feedback about the benefits of future-proofing the Act and positive reception to that, there were also concerns and questions about appropriate oversight and scrutiny, and also questions on how such future-proofing might take place through primary legislation or regulations. So although the recommendations and proposals that we put forward today fall under this broad idea of future-proofing and one umbrella, there are further considerations for proposals for 3 main areas, which are new categories of cells, the 14-day rule, and the use of heritable nuclear germline and genome editing in assisted reproduction. We do know that in the process of future-proofing the Act, there is a much longer list of consideration that will need to be made in any such future-proofing, but we felt that these were 3 issues that are, should we say, the most pressing that need consideration at this point of time for proposals to the Department of Health and Social Care. So we would be starting with considering the recommendation of future-proofing the Act more broadly, and then go through the possible, should we say, sub-proposals on the three other more pressing issues within scientific developments. Thank you, Anna. So what I think we should do, but maybe rather than go through everybody twice, there are sort of two, there's the headline area, you know, do we want to recommend changes to future-proof the Act, which, for example, oh, sorry, Francis, can you hear me now? Hello, they're frozen again. Oh.
Yes, we lost about a sentence. We never lose more than about a sentence each time, but it does jolt the flow.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. It's the rubbish IT in this building, which is it's so unacceptable. I apologise. So there's sort of two things I'd like when you put your hand up. I'd like you to each of you to discuss. The first is the recommendation for future-proofing the Act more generally. For example, you know, there may be clauses which say that certain things can be dealt with in regulations and so on, so you don't have to go back to primary legislation every time you want to do something. And, you know, there are a lot of different ideas about what future-proofing might mean, but it's along those lines. And I think that's, you know, that the how is less sort of controversial, if you like, than the what, let's do it or not. And I'd like your ideas for that. Within that, we could either do further work on these three areas, which are quite in themselves controversial, or we could just say nothing and perhaps leave it to the wording future-proofing the Act to enable us at a later stage to use regulations or other sort of legislation, or in fact go back to primary legislation if we want to, for example, interfere with the 14-day rule. Or we could say, well, actually, we think we should deal with that now and we should do some further work. I mean, those three things, they're quite controversial. They would require a great deal of work. And they, you know, there are a lot of issues related to them. So we can decide we want to deal with this sort of nowish, or actually we can park it on the basis that status quo works and worry about dealing with this later once the Act has been future-proofed, if that sort of makes sense. So who would like to kick off? Francis.
So clearly we want to be able to be nimble on our feet, don't we? And I think that does mean moving to a system whereby potentially the HFEA has more powers, in that if we always have to wait for Parliament to have time to review things and change the law, we may find science slipping away with us. And I'm particularly aware of this in terms of regulation of new categories of cells, both artificial gametes and artificial embryo-like entities. I think it will be very hard for Parliament to respond quickly enough to be able to regulate them in the way that I get the feeling that people would generally like there to be some sort of control. And if that became a delegated responsibility for the HFEA, that would at least enable us to respond in a timely manner. I'm aware, I have heard some very powerful arguments from very eminent researchers as to why they would like to see the 14-day rule extended. I'm also aware of the fact that this is an extremely controversial area. And I think it's likely that Parliament themselves would want to debate and approve any change there. And as far as heritable nuclear germline genome editing is concerned, that there is currently an international moratorium on doing that, and I see no good reason at the moment for changing that. And once again, I think that's probably something that sits with Parliament rather than a delegated responsibility to the HFEA.
Okay. So your view, just to be clear, is that you'd probably recommend maintaining status quo on all of those for the time being?
Well, I'm not sure for the new categories of cells. I'm not sure I completely understand what the status quo is. They seem to me to slip a bit between the net, don't they?
You're entirely right, Francis. So effectively, at the moment, they're not regulated at all.
Yeah.
So the question is, should they?
Yeah.
And they could be regulated either by us or by some other sort of body. And as you know, Francis, there's an open debate among scientists active in the field now about the extent to which there should be some kind of oversight, whether that should be voluntary or statutory. So yeah, I mean that's very real. They're not at the present regulated because they don't fall under the definition of what counts as a permitted embryo in the HFEA Act. And I think the answer to this is not to make them a permitted embryo in the same sense, because they're fundamentally different, but rather to make them something, if you were to move in a statutory direction, that made them sort of allied to but sufficiently different from.
So in that case, for that category, I think I'm recommending further work rather than the status quo, because it seems to me that the status quo is effectively not, it doesn't exist.
I think you are, yes, I agree.
Yeah, although when I looked at that's right, like let's consider it that. But what I was trying to get at is whether, you know, we just look at potential work on that. We could do more work or consider, you know, that under the general future proofing of the Act as when that becomes, you know, when we're closer to worrying about what regulation of those new categories of cells might look like, then the Act allows us to do that. But
I think what I'm saying is that whatever the system is, it needs to be able to be nimble and
exactly. Yeah, and it isn't. No, I agree. That's the point. But that sort of comes in future. Christine.
Yes, I agree. I think we do need to be nimble here. I think the new categories of cells is going to be immensely challenging, because at what point is an embryo not an embryo? And I think certainly in the mouse now, they can make artificial gametes. They can actually make mouse embryos that survive for a certain amount of time. They're not live born yet, but that will happen. So I think it's really important, but there's enormous ethical and philosophical discussions have to be had here about these categories of cells. So I think we need to recommend future work for that. I think that's really going to be incredibly complex. I think for the 14-day rule, I think we need to change that now, because it's now possible to grow embryos for 14 days. It wasn't possible before. The technologies are now there. There's a huge black box between 14 and 28 days in embryogenesis. That's where a lot of pregnancies fail. I think there's a lot of work needs to be done in that time window. I mean, I wouldn't go for 21 or 28 days, but for example, the neural tube will close at 26 days. A neural tube closure is really important. So why not recommend a scientifically justified time point, not some arbitrary, number? But I do think that 14-day rule has to be changed, and I think very quickly. And clearly, the heritable germline genome editing should not happen at all yet. But I would just caution that the CRISPR technology is advancing so quickly that it may become possible to make absolutely precise single base changes in a completely safe way, not too distant from now. And that is going to raise questions about whether that should be adopted to correct, for example, the point mutation that causes cystic fibrosis. So that is going to arise, and I don't think it's so far away. I agree at the moment we have to keep the status quo there. It should be banned. But I think we need to bear in mind that maybe it's not too distant in the future when it might actually become, a little bit more feasible. So I think what I'm saying is, yes, we need to future-proof the Act. We need to do a lot more work on these new categories of cells and embryos. I would say that we need to definitely change the 14-day rule. Further work would be required there, but I think, urge that 14-day rule is changed quite soon. And yes, the status quo with the germline editing at the moment, I think I would support.
Thank you. Tim?
I sort of would be recommending the further work for the new categories of cells and the 14-day rule. These were aspects that were discussed at the recent Horizon scanning meeting we had, at the HFEA meeting held at ESHRA, and And obviously we've had previous discussions within SCAC as well on this. It is a complex area. It's not, I don't think it's as straightforward as just saying, yes, change it to a certain number of days without more work in this, because obviously this has to be balanced between what scientists want and also what non-scientists are happy with. So it's getting that balance. See Christine laughing. It's getting that balance right for the UK as a whole. And the only way we'll find that balance is to do further work on it. So in terms of new categories of cells, absolutely further work. 14-day rule, further work, and status quo with the germline editing will get my vote.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a brilliant discussion, and Francis articulated it very well, and Christine made a really good case about 14-day rule. I mean, these topics are very complex, emotive, and sensitive. Long story short, I'm not repeating those arguments. I would recommend further work. I suppose, Julia, you're looking at recommendation of future-proofing the Act or status quo. I would recommend future-proofing the Act.
Catherine?
Yes, thank you. In terms of both the new categories of cells and the 14-day rule, for the reasons that have been outlined by others, I'm very strongly in favour of further research now. And it seems to me right that because inevitably any wholesale review of the Act now or in the foreseeable future will be subject to a lot of public inquiry and discussion and parliamentary scrutiny, then that's another good reason for incorporating those now. Whilst I'm with others about the fact that we shouldn't be at the moment arguing for further research and consideration of the heritable nuclear germline genome editing for the same reasons that Christine outlined, and we've discussed in relation to the previous topics, I think it is really important to recognise that we'll only get one bite at this cherry. And so whilst I would rule out further work specifically on that now, what I would like to see in our recommendations to the department is a series of principles around any other future scientific development. And the principles would concern two things. Firstly, they'd concern the criteria by which we will assess the necessity to include at our discretion the possibility of further scientific work, of authorization of that further scientific work. And secondly, the principles whereby we would have good governance around that decision making. So that would be partly explaining the processes that we would go through internally, but also by way of consultation, etc., and or reference to an expert advisory groups. And I think that the advantage of coming up with sets of principles on both of those fronts would be that we would build into our recommendations to the department both specifics around the new categories of cells and the 14-day rule, but also we build in a discretion for the HFEA in and of its own volition, properly safeguarded, to consider and to enable innovation which is properly in the public interest and which is in the interest of our consumers.
Thank you. Gudrun.
I find this one most interesting and most important. I think we have to do something. I don't think we can sit still on it, and it seems we're not intending to do that. I think we need to be pushing concepts of types of research that would benefit IVF and people wanting to have babies through IVF, or people who have infertility and want to find a way around their fertility, rather than changing it to a specific time point, for example, with the 14 days. And I think it would be important to remember the reason it's 14 days is because that was considered a point pre-sentience. And I, like Christine, would love to be able to think about looking at the development of the neural tube. But for some people, that and alongside the development of the heart, which occurs sort of around 28, 30 days, up to 6 weeks, people who don't understand the excitement of the science will find that difficult. And so we have to be clever at arguing that what the science is going to do for IVF, for infertility, for reproduction success, to go to certain dates for certain. I think it has to be for certain pieces of work, a little bit like the mitochondrial stuff, rather than some blanket day 20 or day 19. Because as soon as you've agreed that and maybe got that passed, you're then stuck at day 19 until the next time this is reviewed. So if it was much more conceptually flexible and very clever, like Catherine was mentioning, some very clever governance points that stand up. I'm not good at this, but, in legal terms and all the other stuff that you need for these things, then I think we could really make a great improvement to this particular, because this is very important. The science is extremely important. Of course, I'm going to say that, I'm a scientist, but I also think we have to get it right. And we have to bring the populace with us, thinking that we're doing exciting things, changing the Act in this way, because the science is really important. And the science is really important for IVF and for infertile couples. Thanks.
Thank you. Alex?
Thanks, Julia. I don't have too much to add. I think it's a no-brainer. We need to future-proof the Act, just in terms of the cost of going for full legislation, but also we can make the point that scientific advances are happening so quickly, and also the barriers to entry to scientific advances, i.e. the cost of sampling genomes or whatever it might be, are just coming down by the day. So these advances will never keep up with legislation. So I think we can build an evidence base to kind of make the point in section sorry, I've lost my page, section 2 about future-proofing the app. I don't have anything practical to add about how that might be done. I agree with others on the 14-day rule and recommend further work. I think, as I've heard you say in the past, Julia, we do need to be cognizant if this does go. This paper was obviously written from a certain point of view of extension, and if this does go to a parliamentary discussion, there could well be questions raised by members of parliament about whether 14 days is too long, and if this is on the table, should it be reduced? And they would be very reasonable questions to be asked, I would think, whether people in this meeting would agree or not. So we just have to be ready for opening up that possibility.
Yeah, thank you. Graham?
Unmute.
Graham?
Sorry, I didn't unmute. Alex has raised a very good point there, as did Gudrun in what she said, and I do think that we do need, alongside any scientific argument, persuasive ethical arguments as to why, for example, the 14-day rule should be varied. We ought to remind ourselves that it was a much more conservative age that allowed the 1990 Act to go through with the 14-day rule, and a great deal of that was done on the basis of explanations about the worth of a human person, that an embryo before 14 days deserved respect. Its worth was not negligible, but it did not contain full human personhood. And one of the things about the gradual development of the embryo, which isn't, of course, well understood in society at large, is that there's a distinction between those who believe that the earliest period of development, when gender identity is fixed, is the beginning of full human life, and what Alex has just said, I think was illustrated in the consultation. There is a continuing vocal body against all embryo research, which will be agitated by this process. And we mustn't underestimate that, which is why we must get our ethical points in order. I mean, one of the things that I've always believed is that restrictive legislation concerning the treatment of the human embryo strengthens our perception that it belongs in the total mystery of human life, while never giving it such moral significance that undermines our understanding of how human life develops, or to prevent scientific developments. And some of this needs to be, I think, included in our papers so that they're not dismissed as simply the product of one cast of mind, the scientific researcher's cast of mind, which is very important, but isn't the only perspective on these things. So I'm all for future-proofing the Act. I'm all for looking at these issues as described really in the papers, but I do want to make certain that we marshal our arguments that may be persuasive to members of Parliament who would be debating the Act or the bill, and who would be receiving many hundreds, I suspect, of letters trying to persuade them to make the HFE Act more restrictive. We've got to give people arguments that they understand and which are persuasive to them, and they are not simply scientific.
Yes, thank you. Let's hear from the last couple of people who we haven't heard from, then I'll try and say my view, which is Jason. We haven't heard from you.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, so yeah, we do need to future-proof the Act. I absolutely agree with that. Because we don't have a crystal ball and we can't see the future, we can only ever add resilience to the Act, though, can't we? So we're not proofing it, we're making it more resilient to a future that we don't really see. And the science moves so quickly that, in 1990, would the individuals have predicted what's happened in the last 33 years or so? I think it's unlikely that they would have. I do think with regard to new categories of cells, we need to recommend further work. Absolutely, I think everybody's in agreement on that as far as I can tell. With regard to the 14-day rule, there are some very eloquent statements and arguments have been made there. And clearly it is a minefield, but I do feel on balance that we should recommend further work, because we don't want to be seen to be holding back science and the future advantages that could be gained from a greater understanding of development there. And with regard to heritable nuclear germline genome editing, I think we're probably relatively safe to maintain the status quo on that, because we're a long way off it actually happening. But that's just my opinion.
Thank you. And finally, Alison.
Thank you. And I'm just going to echo actually what Jason said, but pick up on what Catherine indicated as well. Recommendation for future-proofing the Act, for sure, with a set of principles. I am concerned that the recommendation for the 14-day rule change overshadows any other aspect of work that we want to get done, and agree with Graham that it needs to be a very persuasive document that needs to be written, bringing in the importance of the science for the 14-day rule, and agree just for maintaining the status quo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. I completely agree with all of you and with what you said, that further work on these subcategories needs to be done. My worry in all of this is, and I think Alex alluded to it, is by the time it gets into primary legislation, well, two things. Firstly, looking at something like the 14-day rule, we've just got to be aware that, and Graham also mentioned this, we have to make very persuasive arguments, because if we look to do further work on it and want to change it, it can be changed both ways, and we know that there is significant pressure in certain quarters for 14 days to be completely reduced or abandoned. But also, the obverse of that is that dealing with these subcategories in primary legislation is really, really hard to do, because I sort of feel that by the time we've got a new act in, I don't know, 3 years' time or whatever, and we've, some of it, what we might have decided to do it, for example, on 14 days, might already be out of date, or there might be something else on there or whatever. So, of course, further work, but we need to think carefully in the proposals to the department to try to look at future-proofing the Act as the core for the primary legislation, with other things being dealt with in regulation. Now, Peter made a really good point that that might be all fine, but we might be criticised for the loss of what he calls democratic oversight, which is basically, HFEA being allowed to make up the rules as it goes along, because it will have lots of powers under regulations and not under primary legislation. So there's a balance there. And maybe what we ought to be doing, actually, and we can see it in these proposals, and you'll see it in the next draft, is going to the department saying, look, this is what we think the Act needs to be future-proofed so that we can be much more nimble, because if we do anything more specific, it'll be out of date in a very short space of time. But these are the likely areas that are coming up, and maybe more work needs to be done on them, and maybe we need to think whether they are actually within primary legislation or in fact dealt with under future-proofing regulations, for example. Because, the science is always going to move quicker than the legislation. And so we need to think about how we marshal our arguments for that. So basically, on the three more contentious areas, thank you very much. I think we have pretty much we need to think now how we take what you've all said today and make sure that the confidential draft proposal that members have and that we're now going to refine reflect today's discussion. But Peter, Claire, from your point of view, I think that was very helpful.
Got a bit of work to do over the summer.
Yes,
there's a bit of work, but
I think you're right, Julia. I mean, we've got a clear steer from you now, which is enormously helpful. That will enable us to go back to the very early draft you've got at present and start to firm that up. And then I suspect that we can be in a place in September whereby there may still be some, questions remaining within that draft that you will need to resolve collectively. But actually, the numbers of questions are becoming fewer and fewer, and we have and that together with, as Claire said, the document on the consultation itself and so on, we should be in a position to provide you with a package of material in September that I think will allow you collectively to reach a kind of decision that you're all comfortable with.
And I think, Claire's sort of gone pale.
We'd like a holiday as well, if that's at all possible.
I actually think you'll get your holiday, because I tell you why. That we've said that in some areas, particularly in this last point, that further work needs to be done. But we don't need to do that work now. I think a lot of and I'm seeing nods from you on the table. My view very much is a lot of what we've just discussed, we don't need to do now. We don't need to do it before September, because we need to engage the department in order to know what they feel, what we think work should, what they think, what work they think needs to be done and what they think we need to prioritise, and not just try to second guess it all ourselves, which I think will be a huge burden on the authority exec, but also not necessary. I don't think we need to do it now. I think we've got enough to go to them, and what we can say to them is, look, these are the areas where we've got more questions. We think more work needs to be done. What do you think? Who needs to be doing this work? Because again, some of the work in the scientific sphere, it's not just us.
No.
It may not be us. It may be somebody else with us partnering with them or helping. We can share it out. So I think we've actually got some. We're able now to give a very robust document into the decision without, a huge burden on the execs between now and September. So I think we've sort of come to the end of this. The one thing I would like to ask for is that Anna, Claire, the team are now going to be refining the draft. We'd love very much to be able to reach out to authority members for some help with, expertise in some of the drafting, or to share bits of it with you for your comments. I'm aware of everyone people are going to be on holiday, I know that. But if we could, if you're not able to, then you can't. But if we could help, and if anybody wants to volunteer on any particular areas, just let Claire know. But it would be really helpful just to buy a teeny ask for a tiny bit of your time on specific areas for some of you, particularly on the sciencey questions. Be really helpful. Okay. Has anybody got any other business or wants to make any final comments? Well, thanks everybody, really very much indeed, much appreciated. Have a wonderful summer, hopefully either roasting or freezing, depending on which bit of the world you're going to be in, and look forward to seeing everybody back in September. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.